Chapter 157. Every Man Loses Friends. Tuesday, May 14, 19,961,456, Z1056, Edprometric Technology Corporation, Waltham, Massachusetts, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, ring, snake, cup. For some reason, the bathroom toilet didn't refill after I flushed it. I looked at it, puzzled. Maybe it was time to call the facilities department and have them check it out. Irritated and still nervous about my first full-time job in an office after graduate school, I headed back to the room to call facilities. I had just picked up the phone when my manager raced into the room with a frantic look in his eyes. I tensed. What had I done now? I'd only been here 3 months, and the learning curve was steep. Before I could say anything, he blurted out, "You're originally from here, right? And you went to MIT?" I looked at him, confused. "Yes, why?" "There's been a terrorist attack. Someone managed to drop a bomb into the cabin, destroying 2 of the 4 towns down there. The water drained out through eye entry into MIT, destroying half of MacGregor and one of the fraternities, number 6, whatever that means." I stared at him, incredulous. "What, when, who?" "It happened maybe half an hour ago. I just found out about it. I've already sent Mark home. He's another alum, in case you didn't notice. If you want to go home, go ahead. You don't need to take vacation days." The death toll has been catastrophic. Supposedly over 7,000 dead already, and the number is probably going to go up. They don't know who did it yet, but they're looking. 7,000 dead. I froze for a second in shock. My brain simply refused to process this. Finally, I found my voice again. 7,000. How can that wait? Was Cambridge flooded out? Was MIT destroyed? Cambridge and Boston are all right. Virtually all of the casualties were in the 2 towns, which were destroyed in a matter of seconds. Death was likely by drowning or the shock of 80 feet of water hitting them. There are maybe only 300 or so dead on the surface. It would have been a lot more were it not for the fact that 2 witches risked their lives to plug the hole and seal the leak. One of them is actually a student at MIT, and I suspect you may know her. She lives in Russian House, and her name is... I never got a chance to hear what her name was because at that moment the phone rang. I looked at the phone and then at my manager. He said, "It's probably classmates or friends of yours. Answer it and then take the rest of the day off." He raced out of the room as the phone continued to ring. As I picked it up, I heard faint sirens in the background. It sounded like police cruisers and emergency vehicles were heading down South Street towards the Turnpike and Commonwealth Avenue. This didn't sound good, I thought. Starting to panic, I picked up the phone. It was my mother. "Do you have access to a radio where you are, or a TV? If you do, turn it on. There's been a terrorist attack in the cabin which flooded parts of MIT. Most of your dorm has been destroyed. Either go home or come here. It's important that you see this." That seemed to confirm my manager's story. If my mother said it, it was almost certainly true. "I'll do that." My manager just ran in, mentioned the attack, and told me to go home and watch. "I'll be right over." I hung up the phone and raced out the door. It turned out that I was not the only person leaving work early. The entire parking lot was filled with people heading for their cars. There was actually a small traffic jam trying to get out of the parking lot and onto Turner Street. I had just turned from Turner Street onto South Street when I heard a loud noise overhead. Craning my neck, I saw a formation of fighters fly by lower and faster than anything I'd ever seen before. I braced myself for a sonic boom, but it didn't come. They were heading west, presumably towards the cabin. Where had they come from? Logan, Hanscom. Wherever they were going, they were in one hell of a hurry. I turned onto Commonwealth and started heading eastbound and started seeing even more troubling signs. The airspace above Boston was filled with helicopters, including large ones which looked almost military. I counted no fewer than 5, and my view was partially blocked by trees. Something had happened there which had attracted news reporters like bees to honey. There were also smaller specks which I suspected were brooms, and a few angular objects which looked suspiciously like flying carpets. Crossing over the turnpike, I saw that the road was absolutely jammed in both directions. Everyone and their brother was likely trying to get out of Cambridge or get into Cambridge to see what had happened. Increasingly disturbed, I turned on the radio and switched to WBZ, the news station. The news was not good. We've got the Mercy and Comfort headed over to Boston right now as we speak, but they're not going to get there for a while. The governor has declared Cambridge a disaster area and has asked for the National Guard to come protect the fresh pond water supply and keep all non-essential personnel away from it. What are the Cambridge police doing now? They're evacuating people from the school down the side streets. The kids were already stressed out with finals coming up, and this will just make things worse. Traffic is a mess throughout the area, and Memorial Drive has been completely washed away from MacGregor almost to the Mass Ave Bridge. The cops are in the process of reconfiguring Memorial Drive so that it will become outbound in both directions. I'm not sure how far they will be able to go on Route 2 before they hit the cordon around Fresh Pond, though. Are the bridges all right? As far as we can tell, everything seems to be holding. However, there are signs that a couple of the supports to the Mass Ave Bridge were weakened substantially. Officials have no idea what that girl did to keep the bridge in one piece, so for the time being the governor has closed the bridge to all traffic. Has there been any flooding in Boston yet? Thankfully, no. One of those two witches cast a spell which opened the Charles River Dam all the way, and all that excess water is headed straight into the Atlantic. Are there any more wizards helping out with the rescue? Has Guinevere woken up yet? Both of the girls are asleep now, and several people are worried they may be in shock. As far as other wizards go, I see a couple of brooms and flying carpets out my window here. One of the flying carpets is landing on what's left of J entry, even as we speak. The one wizard I spoke to was from a wizarding facility hidden in MT, St. Helens. He doesn't expect many people from the 4 towns to show up because half the population just drowned, and the survivors are probably panicking and trying to figure out what happened. They've got their hands full. The commentary was interrupted momentarily by a series of sirens. I moved out of the way as a whole convoy of emergency vehicles barreled past me down the street. Who did it? The only group I could think of which could have pulled off something this big would be Al-Qaeda. Was Al-Qaeda trying to blow away the wizards so that they could be able to follow up this attack with a larger one on the Muggle population? That didn't make sense. First, there were other wizarding facilities in the country, and none of the others had been taken out. Second, I suspected that the wizards would be able to defend themselves against a Muggle terrorist. There was always the possibility that the wizards had managed to hire a jihadist wizard, however. Osama bin Laden had indicated that he wanted jihadist wizards to join Al-Qaeda. Had they done so and taken over the organization? Had bin Laden not realized that he was asking for trouble by trying to get wizards involved? The radio continued its report. They didn't know who did it yet, and the death toll was now up to 7,400. However, they had a couple of suspects. Stephen Pitmoss, the inflammatory preacher behind America for Humans, had boasted that America for Humans was about to attempt an attack on wizards. There were also rumors coming out of Washington that Al-Qaeda had been planning an attack as well. I still couldn't believe this was happening. It was just surreal. I was definitely in shock. Had I been 2 years younger and still at school, I would have likely been dead. It occurred to me that Heather and Pascal were probably still living in H entry. Had they been killed by the attack? I hoped not. There had been army units surrounding the Quabin ever since Al-Qaeda had called in their terrorist threat. Yet for some reason, those army units hadn't caught anything unusual on their video cameras before the explosions. My mind was racing as I turned onto Montville Road and into my parents' driveway. I raced into the den to find my mother watching TV. Supposedly, my father was on his way home. Channel 5 had gone to a split screen. The left side of the screen was showing what appeared to be the Quabbin. The normally placid surface of the reservoir was still full of waves and bodies, and the water had turned a murky brown. The comment about the water shortage just came to mind, and I suddenly realized the implications of the attack. Most of eastern Massachusetts was now without drinking water. How was the Boston area going to be able to quench its thirst, or even bathe, for that matter? I suspected that some MRA official had shut off the valves connecting the Quabbin with the city. That would have explained the incomplete flush at work. The reservoir was surrounded by a large ring of damp ground and dead fish, indications that the water level had dropped. Perhaps most astonishing was the fact that off in the distance, an odd spire poked out of the water. It appeared that the water level had sank enough to allow one of the buildings in the surviving wizarding towns to break the surface. The right side of the screen was showing footage was likely coming from one of the helicopters hovering above Cambridge. The caption said that it was a shot of Mitt near where the water had come out. I stared at the disaster zone for a few minutes, not recognizing it at first. It took me a good 30 seconds to realize what I was seeing. The entire south side of MacGregor was completely gone, washed away. One frat had completely disappeared, and another had been badly damaged. Burton seemed to have been nicked as well, and one of the walls seemed to be tilted precariously. There were small specks near Burton, who were likely people trying to do what they could to prevent the dorm from collapsing. Amazingly, the high-rise and part of J entry had survived. However, there was no way out of the building due to debris and remaining floodwaters. The camera zoomed in on the roof of the high-rise, which had been covered with multicolored darts. The darts suddenly grew into people. Somehow, students had gotten onto the roof and were clamoring to be rescued. I even recognized a few of them, and my face paled. A helicopter approached, and they started waving their hands frantically. One girl actually lifted her shirt to try to attract the chopper's attention. It didn't work, however, as the helicopter hovered above the side of the roof opposite her and released a rescue basket. I watched in horror as the students began fighting to get onto the helicopter. One of them threw a punch and knocked someone off the roof. The man fell 18 stories and disappeared in the debris. The commentator screamed in horror when she saw that. Concerned that the camera would pick up more graphic images, the camera zoomed back out to the larger view. Several of the windows in the high-rise had been opened, and people were sticking their heads out and screaming for help. A recent spate of suicide attempts jumping from MacGregor windows had forced the school to install blocks on the windows to prevent them from opening all the way. The school was filled with engineers, however, and engineers often found ways to circumvent obstacles. I couldn't watch. Stammering incoherently to my mother, I started heading out of the den up to my room. Just as I was about to leave the den, however, the picture changed. I paused for a moment to see the new footage. The image was once in split screen. However, this time it had before and after pictures of the Quabbin. The changes were shocking. It was now about an hour after the attack, and the reservoir had turned a murky brown. Small angular islands stuck out of the water on the western side, presumably wizarding buildings which had been exposed by the receding water. The entire shape of the reservoir had changed, and the announcer suspected that the water level had dropped a good 50 feet. The terrorists had actually done something which changed the map of Massachusetts. It then changed to a picture of two women surrounded by guards. Both of them appeared to be sleeping or dead. One of them seemed to be a witch about my age. She was dressed in wizard robes. I recognized the other from Russian House. That was all I could take, and I headed up to my room. Chapter 158. Clinton comments on the Quabbin attack. Tuesday, May 14, 19,961,600 Z, 1200 Edtaville Office, White House, Washington. DQ United States of America. Text of the President's speech to the nation. Good afternoon, my fellow Americans. As you are probably aware, America experienced a terror attack more insidious and more devastating than anything before in this country's 220-year history. Today's date, May 14th, 1996, will likely be remembered throughout history along with December 7, 1941. First, some background. As you are aware, there are groups of wizards living among us. Although a few of them live among the general population, most of them live in wizard-only cities, hiding in obscure locations throughout our great land. Some of them live inside Mt. St. Helens. Others live in the Ocala National Forest, protected by dirt roads which make driving and hiking impassable. However, the oldest and most populous wizarding settlement can be found in central Massachusetts, underneath the Quabbin Reservoir. According to history as we know it, the Quabbin Reservoir was formed in the 1930s to provide drinking water for the Boston metropolitan area. Although the reservoir does perform that function, it serves a second purpose as well: to hide four wizarding towns which have existed in that area ever since the Salem witch trials of 1692 forced them to flee from Salem and Boston. These four towns comprise our nation's wizarding capital district, similar to the Muggle Washington, D.C. They include Dana, the wizarding capital, Greenwich, Enfield, and Prescott. The four towns have roughly 5,000 people each, people just like you and me, except that the vast majority are capable of casting magical spells. This terror attack was aimed at destroying the nerve center of wizarding life in this country. Although the attack appears to have been successful, it is up to us to ensure that the wizards survive this ordeal and rebuild their lost infrastructure. By now, most of you have probably heard stories about wizards. Some of you may have met them. I certainly have, and I can assure you that they are good people, just like you and me. They may have the ability to cast spells, a power which may confuse and frighten some people. However, they have the responsibility and discipline to use that power wisely. Just look to England, where wizards saved dozens of lives in the Canary Wharf terrorist attack. The details of the attack are still coming in. However, here is what is known so far. At 10:30 this morning, Eastern Daylight Time, two explosions took place in the Quabbin. One of the detonations occurred 75 feet down, directly over the town of Dana. The second one occurred on the surface, in the town of Greenwich, near the second town's border with Dana. These explosions created shock waves in the water. These shock waves encountered the magical shields which have protected the cities from the waters of the Quabbin for over 60 years. Having been cast at a time before tremendous explosives, when the statute of secrecy was still in effect, the shield's creators had not anticipated that Muggles would try to detonate bombs inside the reservoir. The tremendous pressure waves generated by the explosions overwhelmed the shields and deactivated them. In a matter of seconds, the towns of Dana and Greenwich were wiped off the map as millions of gallons of water, intended to quench the thirst of Bostonians, fell on top of them. The Dana device went off first, catching the entire city completely off guard. Virtually everyone in the town drowned. Within seconds, almost 1,000 lives were snuffed out. The tragedy, however, had just begun. Seconds later, the second device went off over Greenwich. Fortunately, the disaster in Dana had alerted the people in Greenwich, and many of them teleported away before the shield broke. As a result, only about 2,300 people were killed in Greenwich, 7,000 dead, and there were more to come. I now have the authority to reveal that there was a secret passageway connecting the four towns with one of the dorms, MacGregor House, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This was created to allow the wizards in the four towns access to world-renowned scholars in the Boston universities. The four towns had to keep more or less up to date with Muggle technology in order to support the Department of Magic, with Travis Radner at its head. At the time of the attack, this corridor was open. By chance, the four towns' end of the corridor was in Dana, one of the towns which was attacked. When Dana flooded, the water began draining out of the corridor into Cambridge. Two of the divisions of MacGregor House, H entry and G entry, were completely destroyed. The first floor of J entry was flooded, and half of F entry was blown away. Students in entries A, which are situated in a tower 16 floors high, were unable to escape the high-rise due to water and debris. Helicopters are in the process of evacuating them from the roof. Had it not been for the fact that many students were taking finals at the time, the death toll would have been much higher. The flood waters raged on, knocking down the Delta Psi fraternity and part of Theta Delta Chi. They damaged the walls of another dorm before heading out onto Memorial Drive, a busy Cambridge roadway. The flood obliterated the road and threw bodies, cars, and debris into the Charles River. Floating cars collided with the supporters of the bridges crossing the river, compromising their integrity. If one of the bridges collapsed, it would have triggered an avalanche of debris which would have destroyed all of the Charles crossings, interrupted Amtrak service, disrupted two Boston subway lines, and potentially destroyed a major I-93 connector. The entire Charles River basin could have flooded as the river was choked with debris, placing most of the Back Bay district of Boston underwater and threatening the lives of tens of thousands of people. However, two young witches risked their lives to save the people of Boston. One of them, Guinevere de Mornay, was in Enfield at the time of the incident. She hurried over to MIT, teleported her boyfriend, a senior there, and his roommate from the Alpha Chi Gamma fraternity over to a Buddhist retreat center near the Quabbin, and returned to MIT to help another witch, and MIT student living in Russian House, save the day. The Russian House student immediately demonstrated the abilities which made her a candidate for one of the finest engineering schools in the world, sending Guinevere off to cast spells to enhance the integrity of the downstream bridges and open the Charles River Dam so all of the excess water flowed unimpeded into the Atlantic. Guinevere then returned to MacGregor, where she and the MIT student combined their powers to seal off the entrance to the Dana-Cambridge corridor with debris from the collapsed dorms. The two women collapsed with exhaustion shortly after the corridor was sealed. However, their spells worked. The corridor has remained sealed, and the water level of the Charles is beginning to return to normal. They will be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of our country's highest civilian honors, and the Order of Merlin, First Class, a great wizarding honor, at a ceremony later on this month. The sealing of the corridor, however, will not mean the end of problems for Boston. Although there is no longer water flowing into the city from the Quabbin, most of eastern Massachusetts has lost access to clean drinking water for a month or even more. United States Navy ships and other military resources are en route to Boston as I speak, ready to help. Wizards are converging on Boston from all over the country. Furthermore, Claude Lecroc, the Canadian Secretary of Magic, has promised a prompt response. Bostonians are being urged to conserve water and to not steal from the Fresh Pond Reservoir in Cambridge, the only source of drinkable water in eastern Massachusetts. Now to the specifics of the attack. We do not yet know who is responsible for the attack. However, we have two major suspects. Al-Qaeda warned us about a possible attack last week, but they did not specify a target. They're one possibility. Another is America for Humans, a fringe anti-wizard hate group based in Kansas. Their primary preacher, Reverend Stephen Pitmoss, had announced during his sermon 2 days ago that a wizarding target would be attacked. More information will come in as it becomes available. Rest assured, people of America, that my administration will not rest until the perpetrators are found and brought to justice. The FBI and Secretary of Defense is currently examining security tapes taken from sites around the Quabbin at the time of the attack to determine if there are any clues. The only rumor that has come out so far was that the cameras picked up the sound of a small aircraft engine, but have, at least at this point, not included a camera angle which has shown the plane itself. Rest assured, citizens of America, that I am doing everything humanly possible to ensure the safety of all Americans, wizard or muggle. Although I cannot get into too many details, rest assured that security is going to be stepped up throughout major cities and around wizarding locations. These extra measures may inconvenience you for a while, but rest assured that it is for your own good. Furthermore, as of this moment, all wizarding centers are off limits to Muggles without explicit written permission from the head of the wizarding center which the Muggle wishes to visit. Any Muggle who attempts to approach a wizarding headquarters without permission will be taken into custody and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Furthermore, there will be 5-mile no-fly zones around all Department of Magic offices, including the remaining 2 towns in the Quabbin. These no-fly zones will extend up to 18,000 feet. Your congressmen and local news broadcasts will go into more details about your area. Secretary Radner was away from Dana at the time of the attack, and he is as committed as I am to bringing these criminals to justice. He returned to Enfield during the past half hour to inspect the damage and to reassure the frightened wizards that no further attacks will be coming their way. The wizarding capital has been moved to Enfield for the time being, and cabinet sessions will be held in the Great Hall of the Salem Witches Academy, the women's division of the Quabbin Academy of Sorcery Magical School. The headmistress of the SWA, sorceress Persephone Ariadne, helped stabilize conditions in the 2 surviving towns immediately after the attack. She was immediately recommended for Deputy Secretary of Magic, and she accepted the position. She will be succeeded as headmistress by sorceress Gabriella Malson, the potions teacher. The men's division of the CAS, led by headmaster Arthur Nagel and visited on the initial tour of Dana, was situated in Dana and destroyed in the attack. Nagel was killed immediately. The surviving students will be enrolled in the Salem Witches Academy as the SWA's first male students and begin attending classes in Enfield in the fall. That is all for now. If any new information comes in, I will inform you at once. However, until then, rest assured that the United States government will be taking care of everything for you. You will be safe in the palm of our hand. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen, and may God bless the United States of America. Chapter 159. One Pissed Prophet. Tuesday, May 14, 19,961,625. Zalaxa Mosque Jerusalem. Samuel stared in horror at his interpreter and the Kohen Gadol. He could not believe what he was hearing. After 3,000 years, one would have expected society to become more civilized, or at least God-fearing. He had initially been pleased when he had received word that the God of Abraham was now honored by over half of the world. But how God-fearing could people be if they did things like this? 7,000 people killed in a span of seconds by a group of people who appeared to be roughly equivalent to a band of anti-monarchists. 7,000 people. The number staggered them. That was probably the entire population of Hebron in his time, possibly even Jerusalem. He'd never heard of a large city being destroyed so quickly other than in the legends of Sodom and Gomorrah. Where would it stop? The destruction of Rome, that tremendous city which served as John Paul's headquarters. John Paul had told him that there were millions of people in Rome. Samuel couldn't even conceive of such a large number. He doubted that entire kingdom of Israel had had 1 million people when Saul and David were struggling with the throne. The only nations which could have had 1 million people were the powerhouses like Assyria and Egypt. The destruction of a city the size of one of those 2 kingdoms in a matter of seconds would be a disaster unparalleled in human history. A terrible thought suddenly occurred to him. These modern humans had managed to harness the powers God had used to create the universe. They had already admitted that they figured out how exactly he had created animals, something called evolution. Were these people arrogant enough to try to play God, wielding divine powers in the name of God, but without the wisdom of God? Had this civilization forgotten the legends of the Tower of Babel and dared to challenge him? God was abstract, and Samuel knew that. Voices weren't exactly going to come out of heaven and started screaming Avada Kedavra at everybody. But the Tower of Babel story was a valid warning in this case. If you rise too high and forget your mortality and where you came from, your civilization will corrupt itself and disintegrate in the blink of an eye. Akkad and Sumer had done that by the time he had been born, and he had repeatedly preached that Egypt and Assyria would follow in their footsteps at some point. Judging from what the Kohen Gadol had told him, his prediction had come true. Samuel didn't want to admit this to himself, but he was getting a bit fed up with trying to deal with this complicated society he had found himself in. He had done what he could to try to redeem these people, but he was only one man. He was not Moses, blessed with divine intuition, the power to lead a people. He was not Joseph, an Egyptian secretary of agriculture versed in prophecy. He was Samuel, an ordinary wizard who was trying to help the community. Perhaps he wasn't strong enough to accomplish this task. He looked to his right, where Angia and her interpreter were standing and listening to the Kohen Gadol. Both women were wearing modest clothing, and the only way to figure out who was to check which one was the ghost. God worked in mysterious ways. He had likely reunited Angia and Samuel for a reason. It started to dawn on him that having the two of them team up might be part of the solution. Angia was a warlord, familiar with fighting and diplomacy. She was also a prophetess able to disguise herself as a bee. She thought women should have the same rights as men, something Samuel never really understood. He had to admit, however, that she was a brilliant and forceful woman. She would make a better leader than he would. However, many of these cultures would not allow women into positions of authority. But if Samuel himself took the lead and had Angia as one of his advisors, it had taken him a good 20 minutes to hit upon a solution, one which would probably catch all of these people completely off guard. He had spoken with Angia about it earlier, without any interpreters in the room to serve as potential leaks. She thought it was clever, particularly since these people considered him to be the first prophet they'd had in over 1,000 years. They decided to give these people one more chance for their society to redeem itself before springing their trap. He brought himself back to the present, however. Blinking his eyes in an attempt to regain control, he choked. That's impossible. The Kohen Gadol shook his head, tears in his eyes. I'm afraid not, Holy One. I just saw it on the news. Terrorists have detonated bombs above the headquarters of the United States Department of Magic and killed 7,000 wizards. Angia looked at the high priest quizzically. United States, bombs. Samuel explained. The United States is a large nation on the western continent, Angia. It is likely the most powerful nation in the world at this point. Bombs are devices which explode and destroy things. Angia stared at him. These people have explosive devices which can kill 7,000 people. The Kohen Gadol nodded slowly. I'm afraid that's just the start of it, Mistress Deborah. We have devices which can destroy millions of people in an instant. Thankfully, these devices have not been used for 50 years. Inshallah, they will never be used again. Angia grunted and muttered that these devices would have helped a lot subduing Jericho and places like that. Samuel glared at her sharply. I see, Angia. Would you be willing to kill civilians along with the enemy soldiers to conquer the city? What did they do to you? Who would harvest the grain and pay the taxes? Angia's mouth clamped shut. Finally, she shook her head. I see your point. Never mind. Thankfully, neither interpreter translated this interchange. Crisis averted, Samuel turned back to the Kohen Gadol. Who did it? What did the victims do which warrant an attack? The victims were innocent civilians, Holy One. They were attacked simply because they were wizards. What? They were innocent? God curse the attackers. Who was it? I'm going to excommunicate them. No one knows for sure yet, Holy One. However, the prime suspect at this point is an American anti-wizard group called America for Humans. They are led by a minister known as Stephen Pitmoss. Samuel slammed the palm of his hand against his forehead. Not another something for humans group. I'm afraid so, Holy One. Samuel grinned evilly. God help us. However, I've got an idea for this group. They are led by a minister, you said. Yes, Holy One. A minister is a man of God, right? Yes, the position is equivalent to a priest, imam, or rabbi. I thought so. In that case, I'm a man of God. He probably knows who I am, all of you people seem to. If I excommunicate him, he'll listen, recant, and offer compensation for all the victims. The Kohen Gadol closed his eyes. He won't, Holy One. You're a wizard. Even Anya blanched at the ensuing stream of expletives. Afia Siddiqui was still in shock from the news broadcast. She had heard rumors from various al-Qaeda operatives that there was going to be some sort of operation in the US on the 14th. She figured a few people would be killed or injured in a bomb attack. But not 7,400. 7,400 people. It was as if most of the students of MIT had suddenly dropped dead for no fault of their own. This had gone too far, way too far. What was even more frightening was the fact that she followed orders and killed the Russian house witch. It would have been worse. She logged onto the internet and retrieved a copy of the president's speech. However, two young witches risked their lives to save the people of Boston. One of them, Guinevere de Mornay, was in Enfield at the time of the incident. She hurried over to MIT, teleported her boyfriend, a senior there, and his roommate from the Alpha Chi Gamma fraternity over to a Buddhist retreat center near the Quabbin, and returned to MIT to help another witch, and MIT student living in Russian house, save the day. The Russian house student immediately demonstrated the abilities which made her a candidate for one of the finest engineering schools in the world, sending Guinevere off to cast spells to enhance the integrity of the downstream bridges and open the Charles River Dam so all of the excess water flowed unimpeded into the Atlantic. Guinevere then returned to MacGregor, where she and the MIT student combined their powers to seal off the entrance to the Dana-Cambridge corridor with debris from the collapsed dorms. The two women collapsed with exhaustion shortly after the corridor was sealed. However, their spells worked. The corridor has remained sealed, and the water level of the Charles is beginning to return to normal. They will be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of our country's highest civilian honors, and the Order of Merlin, First Class, a great wizarding honor, at a ceremony later on this month. She understood now why Dilmy wanted the Russian house witch taken out. Had she done so, Guinevere would have been overwhelmed, and the entire reservoir would probably have come pouring out into the Charles. This would have caused the river to overflow its banks and destroy most of Boston and Cambridge. Instead of 7,400 dead, there would have been 20,000 dead or more. Her actions, or lack of actions, had saved tens of thousands of lives. Allah had put her on this earth for a reason. It had been his will that she join al-Qaeda and meet the Russian house witch. Finally, she knew what she had been created for, to betray al-Qaeda to the Russian house witch and save thousands of people in the process. She promised to do so as soon as the two witches came back from receiving their awards later on in the week. Chapter 160, A Date at the Morgue. Wednesday, May 15, 1996. Elizabeth's Hospital in Down England Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup Albus Dumbledore walked through the doors of the hospital and did his best to ignore the astonished glances of the people in the reception area. He was soon surrounded by curious muggles who were asking him about the nature of magic, the monster in the football stadium, and the attack in the United States. He did everything he could to try to cut off the interviews because he was on an important mission, one which would likely impact the lives of muggles all over England and perhaps the world. That was, of course, if his investigation revealed what he feared it would. Closing the elevator door in the face of the crowd, he headed down to the basement, where the hospital staff kept the morgue. He walked over to the entrance to the morgue and knocked on the door. A bald, tired-looking man opened the door. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Dumbledore shook his hand. "Mr. Nichols, my name is Albus Dumbledore. I had an appointment with you." Nichols nodded. You're the wizard, right? That is correct. I'm here to investigate the odd circumstances surrounding the attack in Wembley Stadium. Nichols gestured for him to enter the room. I figured one of you chaps would come. Lots of strange things happened around that time, and maybe you can explain what happened with the bodies and with the dog. Dumbledore's eyebrows shot up. Bodies, as in plural. Yes, Mr. Dumbledore. When the attack occurred, all of the people who had been seriously injured were sent here. All of them survived except for one, and his body's in this morgue right now. So far, everything seems normal. However, we also took the corpse of the rabid dog as well, and stored it here as well. We were hoping that further tests would identify which species the animal was and who its owner had been. That sounds reasonable. What did you find? The mortician bit his lip. Well, when we came back the next day, the dog's body was gone. In its place was a chap I'd never seen before. He appeared to have been shot multiple times. Yes, Mr. Dumbledore, shot. We checked to see if there had been a mix-up with the bodies, but the computer searches revealed that nothing out of the order happened. We bring in the carcass of the dog, and when we wake up the next morning to start the investigation, the dog had been replaced with this gunshot victim. Dumbledore looked at the hem of his robe for his moment. He didn't like this, as everything so far supported his theory. Turning back to the mortician, he asked, "Do you remember how the animal in the football stadium died?" The mortician consulted his notes. It was shot 5 times, and the man suddenly cut off mid-sentence as something occurred to him. Interesting coincidence, Mr. Dumbledore. The human corpse which replaced the dog's also had 5 bullets in him. It's almost as if the dog had turned into the man, but that's impossible. Dumbledore let determination fill his face. Mr. Nichols, I need to see the body of the gunshot victim. Now. The mortician shook his head. I'm sorry, Mr. Dumbledore. I can't do that unless I get permission first from the authorities. Dumbledore reached into his robe and pulled out a piece of parchment. Does this qualify? Nichols took the parchment and read it over. You've been in touch with the Minister of Magic. You think there's a magical component involved here. Bloody hell, you may be right. Why else would you be here? Dumbledore spoke gently and urgently. I need to see the body, Mr. Nichols. We may have a serious problem that the Muggles don't realize is going to affect them. Nichols looked at him skeptically. Problem? What problem? Dumbledore had to be very careful here. He thought for a moment and eventually said, think biological warfare with a magical origin. The mortician stared at him. You've got to be kidding. That dog had some kind of communicable disease and infected all of the people it bit. Quite possibly. If so, it is a disease that will ravage the entire Muggle population unless we stop the pandemic quickly. Right now, there are fewer than 30 victims. We need to stop it here and now. If wait a few more months, it will be too late and everyone else will succumb. Now, will you lead me to the body, or will I have consult your manager? The mortician didn't need to be told twice. He told Dumbledore to put on a sterile biological suit and follow him into the morgue. The morgue was extremely cold and filled with human-sized drawers which presumably contained human bodies. Nichols scanned the labels on each of the drawers and eventually found the one he wanted. He pulled on the handle and pulled it out, exposing a body covered by a blue top. He pulled back the top so that Dumbledore could see the cadaver. The wizard recognized Remus Lupin immediately. His eyes had been closed, as if he were asleep. There was a bloody hole in his head, which had likely been made by a bullet. Dumbledore shook his head. It is as I feared, Mr. Nichols. I had suspected that it would be this man. A pandemic may be upon us. Nichols whistled. God help us. Who was he? Was he one Voldemort's supporters? No, Mr. Nichols. He was actually one of my staff, and a very devoted member of a group of people determined to destroy Voldemort and his minions. Unfortunately, he was also ill. We thought we had his disease under control, but apparently we didn't. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to release the body to a Ms. Nymphadora Tonks for burial. Who's she? She's a wizard and his girlfriend. Nichols nodded. I'll see to that. What exactly happened here? What did he have? I don't suppose he had a disease which turned people into rabid dogs, did he? It. Nichols's voice drained away as a wild look came into his eyes. Dumbledore braced himself. If the Muggles knew enough about the werewolf myths as Dumbledore feared they did. Nichols suddenly backed off in horror. Good God, this man was a werewolf. It all fits, turning into an animal, biting people, full moon. Dumbledore nodded. Yes, Mr. Nichols. Please keep this to yourself, as I don't want to start a panic. Nichols nodded and slowly calmed himself. Please don't tell me that everyone that he bites also becomes a werewolf and is going to start attacking people like this man did. I'm afraid so, Mr. Nichols, hence the reference to a biological attack. God almighty, when's the next full moon? Dumbledore gritted his teeth. June 1st, Mr. Nichols. Barely over 2 weeks from now. You now see why we need to contact everyone who was attacked and have them come to the Ministry of Magic before that time. Nichols nodded and made a call upstairs. Dumbledore could tell that he was speaking with someone in the emergency unit and that he didn't like what he was hearing. Writing some names down, he hung up the phone. He handed the sheet of paper over to Dumbledore. These are the people we treated at the hospital after the attack. You should inform all of these people that they may have been infected. Dumbledore nodded. Your help is most appreciated, Mr. Nichols. However, what are you concerned about? Nichols pointed at the list. There are 14 people on this list. So, that's good, isn't it? Nichols leaned over the desk at Dumbledore. 27 victims survived the attack. We only know where 14 are. I suspect the other group refused medical treatment because they thought they had just received a scratch or something like that. They thought the rabies shot would be enough to make things better. I take it that a rabies shot will not be enough to turn someone from a werewolf back into a normal person. Dumbledore shook his head. No, it is not. There is no known cure for lycanthropy, but there is a potion that can be created which will alleviate some of the symptoms. How do we get in touch with the other 13 victims? Nichols shrugged. I don't know, Mr. Dumbledore. I honestly don't know. Dumbledore groaned. We'll deal with that problem later. Meanwhile, we should start chasing down these people. We'll start here at the top. I'm sorry, Mr. Nichols, but I can't read your handwriting. Nichols pointed at the top row on the sheet. Lauren Mistry. The first victim's name is Lauren Mistry. Chapter 161. The Locket. Wednesday, May 15, 1996. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Great Britain. Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, ring, snake, cup. Harry Potter stared at Headmistress McGonagall. Snape was sick, and there was no replacement. They had yet another free period, this time right after one which would have been Transfiguration. Granted, it was an interesting class, defense against the dark arts, instead of Snape's old standby, potions. But another free period would be useful, especially with owls just around the corner. Harry had no idea what he was going to do about owls. He had been out for over 2 months and was way behind on his work. Would he have to take the exams not fully prepared? The only good thing, Horace Slughorn had proven to be an exceptional potions teacher. The change of instructor had catapulted potions into the stratosphere as far as Harry was concerned, placing it just below defense against the dark arts in his ranking of favorite classes. He was pleasantly surprised when he heard that Slughorn had been a Slytherin. Good Slytherins existed after all. He headed out into the corridor with the rest of the Gryffindors. Everyone was talking about the recent attack in the United States. Minister Scrimgeour had recommended that the Prime Minister muster up several divisions of British soldiers and station them around potential wizarding targets. America for Humans, the group which was most likely behind the attack, no one had it yet claimed responsibility, had an equivalent here in the United Kingdom, Britain for Humans. Britain for Humans had already attacked several wizards and had attempted to burn down a church in St. Catchpole. Both Scrimgeour and the Prime Minister had to assume that Britain for Humans would, at some point, attempt a copycat attack. Harry looked out the window, where men with guns and wands ringed Hogwarts and Hogsmeade. The fluke connection to Umbridge's former office had been closed off, and all visitors were barred from entering Hogwarts. These included Sirius Black, who had planned to visit his godson for the first time as a free man. From what McGonagall had heard from the American Minister of Magic, virtually the entire wizarding police force in the United States had been called into an emergency session. The plan was to launch a multi-pronged attack, simultaneously, on every single chapter of America for Humans. The first phase of the attack would likely be done using Muggle forces, as authorities were reluctant to have wizards be seen attacking Muggles. The wizards would only be called in if their problems subduing these locations. Most of the United States was now squarely against America for Humans. One chapter in Kentucky had been burned to the ground by irate Muggles, and Stephen Pitmoss was supposedly running for his life. Many former America for Humans members had apparently defected and turned against their former organization in order to save their lives. The country was angry, and rightly so. 7,000 witches killed in one attack. The sheer scale of the attack was beyond belief. His lifetime ban from playing Quidditch had been revoked, and he was supposed to have been preparing for Quidditch practice today. However, all Quidditch matches had been cancelled in commemoration of the attack in the United States. Students were to be in their dorms the whole time, accompanied by prefects and teachers. He had just about reached the portrait of the fat lady when someone put a hand on his shoulder. He turned around and saw Professor Snape standing before him. The man looked awful. His skin was even paler than usual, and it looked like he hadn't slept for a while. There were a few cuts on his arm as well, which Harry couldn't explain. Harry couldn't help but ask, "Professor, how are you doing? Are we going to be having class after all?" Snape growled at him. "No, Mr. Potter, I am not going to be teaching class today. Instead, I need you to follow me, now." Harry didn't like this. "Sir, we're supposed to be in our rooms now that this attack has taken place, and we still need to do the occlumency lessons." Snape looked furious. "You will come with me, now, or I will take 50 points from Gryffindor for every minute you delay. Time is of the essence here." Harry knew not to argue with Snape when he was like this. Shrugging, he followed Snape towards the headmistress's office. Snape spoke the password, and they headed up the spiral staircase. Harry watched as the former potions master marched into the room, reached into a secret compartment behind McGonagall's desk, and withdrew the sword of Gryffindor. Harry didn't know whether he should be offended by having Snape touching the great weapon. Sword in hand, Snape headed back towards the entrance. Seconds later, they were heading back down. Snape passed the sword to Harry. "Here, Mr. Potter, you will need this." Harry stared at the sword for a moment and accepted the weapon. "Professor, what are we going to do? What's going on?" Snape's answer was evasive, but Harry understood it immediately. "We are following the advice of my former colleague and your late defense against the dark arts teacher, Quirinius Quirrell." Harry's eyes bulged. "You found another one?" "Yes, Mr. Potter, the locket. It is situated at 12 Grimmauld Place." Harry stared at him. "There's a Horcrux in the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix. How on earth did it get there? Didn't Professor Quirrell say it was in a cave somewhere?" Snape grunted sourly, reached into his pocket, and retrieved a piece of parchment. "Indeed, Mr. Potter, he did. There was indeed a locket in the cave. Professor Dumbledore and I went over there to check it out, and were nearly killed trying to drink a potion protecting the locket. Both of us were almost delirious by the time we had consumed enough of the potion to retrieve the locket, and this." Confused, Harry started reading the document. His eyes suddenly widened. "To the Dark Lord, I know I will be dead long before you read this, but I want you to know that it was I who discovered your secret. I have stolen the real Horcrux and intend to destroy it as soon as I can. I face death in the hope that, when you meet your match, you will be mortal once more. It was signed R.A.B. Harry shuddered and handed the document back to Snape. The locket in the cave was a decoy. Snape seethed with anger. Obviously, Mr. Potter. Professor Dumbledore and I nearly killed ourselves, quaffing that potion, only to find that the Horcrux had been in 12 Grimmauld Place the whole time. We removed the note and returned the decoy Horcrux to its original location beneath the potion. If it fooled us, it will fool the Dark Lord if he comes searching for it. How do you know it's in 12 Grimmauld Place? And who's R.A.B.? R.A.B. was Regulus Arcturus Black, one of your beloved godfather's brothers. Had he been alive, I would not know whether to give Slytherin 100 points for taking the Horcrux, or to deduct 100 points from Slytherin for having him make Professor Dumbledore and me drink that bloody potion for no good reason. As far as 12 Grimmauld Place goes, we checked there and found that the original is in fact there. The soul detection spell revealed a living presence in the locket. Harry got excited as he continued Snape's chain of thought. You want me to help destroy it? Is that why you've come here to retrieve me and the sword? That is correct, Mr. Potter. I stopped by to get the sword. As you know, the sword of Gryffindor, steeped in basilisk venom, is one of the few things capable of destroying a Horcrux. And you want me to do it? Snape hissed. You are the only person who can do it, Mr. Potter. You see, the Dark Lord placed the Horcrux inside the locket. It is fairly obvious that in order to attack the Horcrux, we must open the locket. None of us were able to, however. Eventually, Dumbledore realized that in order to open it, someone would have to speak to it in Parseltongue and tell it to open. Harry nodded, which means you need a Parselmouth, and that's me. Correct. Now, please keep your mouth shut as we head through the corridors. We don't want to scare the normal people here. They headed through the corridors with very little resistance as Snape's imposing presence caused everyone to melt out of the way. Eventually, they made it outside the castle. Snape nodded to the soldiers standing guard, who saluted. He then grasped Harry's arm and apparated him into 12 Grimmauld Place. Most of the Order of the Phoenix was there. Dumbledore looked like he had been hit over the head with a baseball bat. He must have also suffered trauma drinking the potion in the cave. Rufus Scrimgeour was there as well, along with John Major. The adults were all standing silently around the dining room table. The surface of the table was completely empty save for one thing, a small green locket hanging from a chain. Snape looked around the room. Ladies and gentlemen, remember the drill. Stay behind me at all times and have your wands at the ready. We don't know what this thing is going to do. Mr. Potter, are you ready? Harry lifted the sword and positioned it over the locket. I am, Professor. Good. Now, imagine that the serpent on the locket is a snake and command the snake to open it. Harry stared at the locket. After a few minutes, he found himself convinced that he was staring at a snake. That should be good enough, he thought. He shouted, "Open it." He couldn't tell if he had spoken Parseltongue. However, judging from the reactions of the people around him, he hadn't. He tried again, this time more clearly. Nothing. Puzzled, he turned to the assembled multitudes. I'm having trouble speaking Parseltongue for some reason. Do I need to have a real snake in front of me for some reason now? Dumbledore stood silently for a second. Suddenly, his eyes widened. I think I have an explanation, Harry. You may no longer be a Parselmouth. Harry shook his head to clear it. What? You may have only been a Parselmouth because Voldemort had a part of his soul embedded in you. When he attacked you, he destroyed that piece and removed your ability to speak with snakes. Harry stared even harder. You mean to tell me I was a Horcrux? Possibly. However, if you were, you are no longer, so let bygones be bygones. Do you remember what you said to open the entry to the Chamber of Secrets? Think hard, Harry. Everything may depend on this. Harry racked his memories for a moment. Finally, the expression came to him. He tried to mimic it as well as he could. After 3 attempts, the locket opened and revealed a disembodied eye. The eye swiveled wildly as it looked around the room. Harry was about to slam the sword down on the table when Hermione Granger suddenly materialized in front of him. "You fool! You don't know what you're doing." Harry lowered the sword for a moment. "What?" Snape roared at him. "Ignore her. It's an illusion. Destroy it." Harry stared at Hermione and then back at Snape. "Sir, I don't think so. She looks pretty real here." Snape swore beneath his breath. Harry picked it up. "I can't believe I'm going to ask him this." Aloud, Snape yelled, "Black, take the sword. You do it." Harry was about to yell at Snape that he'd be able to do the job when he suddenly thought of a good way to test whether this was the real Hermione. Reaching out gingerly, he touched the image of his friend. His hand went right through it as Sirius bellowed at him. "Harry, what are you waiting for? Finish it." Having convinced himself that Hermione was indeed an illusion, he raised the sword once more above his head and swung with all his might. The weapon sliced through the illusion of Hermione and slammed into the eye. There was a hideous screech, and the illusion vanished. Lying before him on the table were the remains of a locket, sliced neatly in two. Shoving Harry out of the way, Snape cast the soul detection spell once more and confirmed that the Horcrux had been destroyed. Everyone cheered and shook Harry's hand. Snape's reaction, however, was short and succinct. "Good work, Mr. Potter. Now, if you have any chance of passing your owls, you will want to translate your determination here to potions." Harry nodded and grasped Snape's hand to apparate back to the area around Hogwarts. At the last minute, though, he let go. Turning to Sirius, he pointed at the table and said, "Sirius, I'm sorry about the table. I think I've left a bit of a scratch." Sirius shook his head. "Don't worry about it. Go, pass your owls, and you can pay for it later if you want. I'm tempted to keep it as a souvenir of how you destroyed the Horcrux." Satisfied, Harry grasped Snape's hand once more, and 12 Grimmauld Place faded around him. Chapter 162. I think we're going to jail. Wednesday, May 15, 1996, Abilene Victorian in Abilene, Kansas, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 3, ring, snake, cup. In a span of less than 36 hours, Stephen Pitmoss had gone from one of the most influential preachers in the nation to public enemy number 1. He should have known that he would be demonstrating the sin of arrogance by allowing his speech linking America for humans to the attack to be posted on the internet. The first church was set on fire less than 8 hours after the attack on the Quabbin. Shortly after this, rumors began spreading that people associated with America for humans were being ridiculed, molested, and in one case actually murdered. This, accompanied by a news report which had placed a $5 million bounty on his head, had convinced Pitmoss that he had to leave as soon as possible. He had done what he could to disguise himself. He shaved off his trademark mustache, replaced his glasses with an old set of contact lenses, and had been in the process of trying to disguise his license plate number when God, as expected, had rewarded him for his strike against the wizards in a most unusual way. The doorbell had rung, revealing a panicked Yolanda Dursley Burgess demanding to know where her husband was. This had placed Pitmoss in a difficult position. Had she known that Patrick had been involved with the attack? Did she know that her husband was likely dead, or at the very least missing? He asked for God for advice, and he told him to tell her the truth. The woman had naturally started wailing and screaming like crazy, and he had done what he could to console her. He had said that he would stand by her no matter what happened, and that God would grant both her and her husband a place in heaven. Then it occurred to him that she had come in a car which was registered to her and not to Patrick, a car which was likely not going to be on the police's watch list. Within the hour, he and Patrick's widow had stopped by Patrick's house, picked up some supplies for Yolanda, and headed westward on I-70. Pitmoss turned on the news just in time to hear a report that FBI agents had broken into his house and were looking for him. They had mentioned that although they hadn't found him, They had confiscated his computer. That wasn't good, he thought. That computer had virtually all of the email addresses and phone numbers of people who headed America for Humans chapters across the nation. With that information, they would be able to track down virtually every single America for Humans member. They had driven as far as they could in one sitting. Eventually, though, they both started to flag. They pulled into a bed and breakfast in Abilene and booked separate rooms under the names David Lawson and Michelle Aronson. They had to take a risk, taking a lot of cash out of the bank in Westboro before they left, as there was no way they'd be able to pay with a credit card. They had woken up the next morning still in one piece, and as far as they could tell, still free. However, the hunt for America for Humans congregations was still going on. Pitmoss opened the window to see the rising sun reddened by what appeared to be thick plume of ash. He turned on the TV, and the local station was reporting that the FBI was in the middle of an operation against the Church of the Holy Savior in Chapman. They had driven through Chapman during their frantic flight out of Westboro. Judging from the town's location on the map, Pitmoss concluded that he was seeing the sun through a plume of smoke from the burning church. Pitmoss swore to himself, a church on fire and a blood-red sun. If this wasn't a sign that the prophecies were coming true, what was? The reporter then shifted to a view of Boston. There were enough naval vessels there to rival Pearl Harbor. He saw at least one aircraft carrier, a couple of destroyers, and ships he'd never seen before. There were helicopters in the air and fighter jets everywhere. It was followed by a brief shot of the devastated Quabbin area, which looked more or less the same with one exception. The little towers which had been poking out of the western end of the reservoir had vanished. The reporter explained that the surviving wizards in Enfield and Prescott had done something to make it so the Muggles would never see their buildings again. A few of the ships were there to protect Boston from looters and possible future attacks. The majority, however, were there for one purpose: to provide clean drinking water to over 1 million thirsty Bostonians. Travis Radner, couldn't that man die? Had warned the governor that, although the surviving wizards were going to do everything they could to make what was left of the reservoir suitable for drinking, it would be a difficult task given the sheer size of the reservoir. The current timetable had the reservoir fit to use by mid-June. Pitmoss was a Christian. He had to do something to help these Bostonians. He had never intended to hurt anyone other than wizards. Perhaps God was persecuting him and forcing him to flee Westboro because he had not yet done something to atone for this sin. But how would he do it? He couldn't use his name and say that he wanted to help because no one would believe him. If anything, they would just pick him and Yolanda up right there and then. It finally occurred to him that although the people here in Abilene didn't know where he was, God did. God would likely understand if he started a rescue fund under the name David Lawson. After having a hearty breakfast with Yolanda and the rest of the guests, he turned to the proprietor and asked if any of the organizations in the area had set up a fund to help the victims of the attack. A couple of them had, but they weren't very organized yet. Pitmoss recommended that the proprietor set up a fund, and everyone who visited the inn could contribute voluntarily if they wished to aid the victims. The proprietor thought that was a good idea, and Pitmoss started the fund off with a $200 donation. Pitmoss was pleased to see several of the other guests writing checks as he left. Pitmoss checked out at 9:00 and had to wait 30 minutes for Ms. Aronson to check out. While waiting, he purchased a copy of the local newspaper. The first 3 pages were all about the attack and showed pictures of the devastated Quabbin, the destroyed parts of Mitt, and the ships in Boston. The death toll had stabilized at about 7,400. America for Humans was still the primary suspect, and the dragnet had caught a good 65% of the organization's members while they slept. 65%. How in God's name had they managed to do that? Pitmoss could only think of one possibility. They had called upon the minions of the Antichrist to help them out with their vile spells. The time of revelation was close, indeed. He returned to the B&B just as Yolanda checked out. He picked up her stuff, loaded it into her car just like a gentleman should, and continued west on I-70. About half an hour went by before a worried Yolanda tapped him on the shoulder. "Reverend, I think someone's following us." Pitmoss grunted and looked into the rearview mirror. There were a few cars on the road, but none of them looked suspicious. She was probably paranoid, he thought. There weren't many places for cars to get off the highway between Abilene and Salina, where Route 81 crossed I-70. He figured most of these cars were either headed to Salina or points west. There was an easy way to find out, however. He turned onto US-81 and drove around Salina for a while, hoping to lose his tail. After about 45 minutes, he turned back onto I-70 and continued heading west. He looked into the rearview mirror. One of the cars, a nondescript black one, was still behind him. Shit, he thought. Well, it could still be coincidence. Hoping against hope, he turned north at the next exit and headed towards the small town of Culver. He thought that it would highly unlikely that any random person driving down the highway would have even heard of this town. He certainly hadn't before. He had to slow down on this smaller road. He could pulled over for speeding, and they'd catch him as soon as they asked for his driver's license. He looked back in the rearview mirror and saw the car still there, behind him. Oh, he thought. He turned on the radio and was greeted with someone indicating that sources said a car whose license plate matched that of Patrick Dursley Burgess's wife had been seen on I-70 in central Kansas. Furthermore, 2 people had paid cash to stay at an inn in Abilene, and one of them had looked exactly like Yolanda Dursley Burgess. The other person had looked a lot like Stephen Pitmoss without glasses or a mustache. Pitmoss began to panic. The road went on, and there was nowhere to get off. Had he been in the position that the police were in now, he would have called the office in Culver and told them to barricade the road and not let Pitmoss's car into the town. This would trap him nicely between the car trailing him and the blockade up ahead. Gritting his teeth, he gunned the motor and began to speed. The only chance he had was to get through Culver before the police had a chance to organize a blockade. He had a brief moment of satisfaction when he saw the car behind him recede back into the distance. The moment ended abruptly when he saw the small town up ahead. Between his car and the town was a whole flotilla of flashing blue lights. He looked back just in time to see the car closing in behind him along with a helicopter. Yolanda shivered in horror. Finally, her shoulders slumped and she began to fall into shock. However, she had time for one quiet comment. "Reverend, I think we're going to jail." Chapter 163, Water Rationing. Wednesday, May 15, 1,996,169, South Street, Waltham, Massachusetts, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 3. Ring, snake, cup. The first thing I did when I woke up was to the sink. As I had been afraid of, nothing came out of the tap. How were people supposed to get by without water? Showering people could get away with. Supposedly, people hadn't bathed much in medieval times, and it hadn't killed anyone. Granted, people would eventually start smelling bad after a while, but people would survive. I hoped the emergency wouldn't go on, as long as the rumors were reporting it would. I knew it was probably a bit selfish of me, but I would really miss those 30-minute hot showers in the morning. Even if the remnants of the quabbin were somehow purified, they would very likely be rationed, because there wasn't nearly enough water to draw up on as there had been earlier. I had stopped by several supermarkets on the way back to Waltham from my parents' house to see if anyone had bottled water. The shelves were completely bare on the first 2 stores I visited, and the third had taped a sign to the front door reading, "We're out of water." Sorry, thinking that some fluids would better than none, I had headed into the store to see if they had any milk or juice. I was able to come away with a couple of bottles of apple juice, but that was it. Disturbed, I stopped by a couple of gas stations to see if their convenience stores had any water left. Nothing. It looked like I was going to have to wash my hands with apple juice at the rate things were going. Either that, or hope that it rained. It wasn't raining this morning, which meant that I wouldn't get a quick rinse from Mother Nature. I walked into the living room and turned on the TV to see if there was any news. Channel 4 was showing aerial footage of what appeared to be a riot outside a Whole Foods. I watched as cops started throwing tear gas canisters into the crowd in an attempt to disperse them. The commentator explained, "This riot starts about 15 minutes ago when a van carrying a shipment of Aquafina bottles parked in front of the store for a delivery. The driver explained that he had been able to deliver only 2 or 3 cases before he was attacked by an unknown assailant. Virtually all of Prospect Street between Central Square and Broadway has been closed off until everything clears up. Note that this is not the same incident as we started the broadcast with, where a Poland Springs delivery truck was hijacked in Mattapan and sent to parts unknown. Back to you, Dave." The anchorman appeared on-screen. "Thank you, Lisa. For those who have just tuned in, there is now a second incident involving a water delivery truck in the greater Boston area. This time, it is at the Whole Foods between Central and Inman Squares in Cambridge. People at the scene seem to have tried to take advantage of the fact that Cambridge still has water and are starting to target stores where the residents would not have been forced to stockpile water. We'll now switch to Mike, who is monitoring the situation near Fresh Pond. The scene shifted to a reporter standing in front of a wooded area. All I could tell was that there were security guards all over the place with guns their hands. Behind them were glimpses of water. The new reporter began speaking. "This is Mike from Fresh Pond, where the perimeter of the reservoir still appears to be secure. There have been a few attempts by angry Bostonians to try to break through the ring of officers and get at the water, but they have all been beaten off. There are a couple of businesses nearby asking the guards to open up Route 2 so that the companies can interact with their customers, but the guards aren't going to accommodate. They say the general public safety is much more important than the success of any individual small business. Inbound traffic is backed up almost all the way to Lexington. The MBTA recommends that people carpool and take public transportation whenever possible. Don't forget that the Alewife Tea Station has a large parking lot." At least I was lucky in one regard, I thought. I didn't have to drive through all of that mess to get from my apartment to Parametric. What was it? 1 mile past Brandeis. I turned off the TV, got dressed, and walked over to the door to head over to my car. I pulled out of the driveway and turned onto South Street. That's when I noticed all of the envelopes sticking out of people's mailboxes, including my own. The paper hadn't been there in the evening when I had checked the mail. This could be important, I thought. Turning around, I headed back into the driveway, parked the car, and walked over to the mailbox. I opened the envelope and saw a water rationing card along with a note. A quick look at the first line of the note made me realize that waiting a few minutes to get to work had been a good thing. May 15, 1996. City of Waltham Water, rationing information. Dear citizen, as you are undoubtedly aware, the Quabbin Reservoir was attacked yesterday by a terrorist organization. The water of the Quabbin was contaminated by the attack, and as a result, it should not be used for drinking, washing, or bathing. The Quabbin Reservoir is the sole water supply for over 1 million people in eastern Massachusetts. The sole exception is Cambridge, which receives its water from the Fresh Pond Reservoir. Cambridge is not included in the water emergency. However, Waltham is. It is unknown at this time how long the emergency will be in effect. It is important, however, to stay calm and consume other liquids whenever possible to quench your thirst. Fruit juices and milk are excellent substitutes. Some of you have asked why we have closed the connections to your faucet completely and not recommended that you boil the untreated tap water. The reason is because the dome of the Greenwich Town Hall served as a storage area for many obscure magical supplies and compounds, several of which can be hazardous to your health. Secretary Radner of the Department of Magic believes that several of these compounds will be able to persist in high enough concentrations to sicken young children and the elderly. The United States government has ordered several Navy ships, including a couple of aircraft carriers, to travel to Boston to assist with providing drinking water to the people of Massachusetts. These vessels will be stationed in the harbor near South Boston. Visitors will not be permitted on board these ships due to security arrangements and the need to distribute water as evenly and as fairly as possible. Each town will be allotted an amount of water proportional to the size of its population. It will be up to each town's mayor or governing council to determine how exactly this water is to be distributed. Although you will be assured of enough water to get by throughout the duration of this crisis, you must understand that the supply is very limited and that steps will need to be taken to conserve the water you receive. As of today, the following regulations will be taking effect throughout our city. 1. The tap will flow to your house for 1 day every week. Which day it is will depend on the first letter of your street name. Streets whose names start with a B or C will have water available Sundays from 12 a.m. to 12 a.m. You will be able to use as much water as you need during this time. The rest of the schedule goes as follows. DF Monday J, Tuesday Chem, Wednesday Q, Thursday U, Friday Z, Saturday. 2. You may find it necessary to obtain water during the 6 days where your faucet is not connected to the tap. In this case, you must mail one of the ration cards supplied to City Hall. Each card will entitle the user to 4 gallons of water for emergency use only. You will receive a new set of ration cards once per week, as long as the emergency lasts. 3. The fire service will be piping water directly out of the Charles, so firefighting operations will not be affected. 4. All of the water being sent to your tap will be safe to drink and will have been produced by the United States Navy's vessels. Note, however, that it will not be fluoridated. You can fluoridate your water by adding fluoride pellets. Contact the City Hall if you wish to receive pellets. 5. If you have any information, feel free to call the State Water Hotline at 1-800-H2O-HELP. Be aware that there may be periods of heavy call volume which will necessitate a wait of a minute or more to speak to a representative. As your mayor, I promise you that we will work through this together. My water will be rationed as well as yours after all. Sincerely. Chapter 164. Bite Victim Hunt. Thursday, May 16, 1996. Bachelor Household 11 Ivy Lanel 14-5, QN Waltham, on the Wolds England Horcruxes left. 3. Ring, Snake, Cup. Peter Bachelor swore when the football match he was watching suddenly disappeared and was replaced by a black screen featuring the word Special Report in red letters. He swore what had happened now. The broadcast. Attention, please. We apologize for the disruption of service, but we have a special report from the office of the Prime Minister at 10 Downing Street. I repeat, this is a special report from the office of the Prime Minister. Peter frowned. Another report from the Prime Minister. What had happened now? Did that bloke Voldemort do something obnoxious to piss off a bunch of people in Devon or somewhere? He suddenly felt a brief stab of guilt. For all he knew, that evil wizard had ensorcelled some people somewhere, possibly torturing or killing them, and he was busy complaining that he couldn't watch the football game. The scene shifted to a shot of the Prime Minister in his office. Seated next to him was Rufus Scrimgeour, the Minister of Magic. Scrimgeour was a household name now, thanks to the debate with Tom Riddle and the flood of interest in the wizarding world over the past few months. The Prime Minister steepled his hands in front of him and began to speak. Good evening, fellow Britons. I apologize for the interruption, but I have come to issue a public service announcement which will be of extreme importance to the people of this kingdom. It is vital that you listen to what I am about to say, as this information could affect the safety and security of you and your loved ones. Peter didn't like this. Voldemort must have done something, he thought. Why would Scrimgeour be making this announcement with the Prime Minister otherwise? He could certainly imagine Tom Riddle trying to take revenge on Scrimgeour and the Prime Minister by harming innocent people. The Prime Minister went on. About 2 weeks ago, on 4 May, there was an incident at Wembley Stadium during a football match between Arsenal and Manchester United. You may recall that a rabid dog was teleported into the stadium by an evil wizard, almost certainly the politician Tom Riddle under his alter ego as Lord Voldemort. This dog attacked a large number of people in the stadium, killing one. To refresh your memory, here is a picture of the animal in question. The view of the Prime Minister's office switched to a still photograph taken from, Peter assumed, a security camera at the stadium. It showed a large dog attacking the patrons. The camera zoomed in to focus on the creature. Peter whistled. That was a very large dog, almost man-size. It looked sort of like a Great Dane gone feral. For a few seconds, he thought that the wizard had teleported in a wolf, but that wouldn't make any sense. How many wolves did he have access to? Peter answered his own question, however. He was a wizard. He could probably conjure wolves if he had to. He had a disturbing vision of a Tyrannosaurus Rex rampaging through Harrods. The Prime Minister returned to the screen. This kind of animal appears to be a crossbreed between a dog and a wolf. It weighs about 200 pounds and stands at least 4 feet tall. It is extremely aggressive and will bite virtually anyone who comes within range of its fangs. Although the specimen which attacked the football stadium was shot and destroyed, we have reason to believe that there may be more of these creatures out there. For those of you with an internet connection, you can download an image of this creature from the government's website. John Major's expression turned grave. Biologists at the University of Oxford have just finished a comprehensive report on the creature. They claim that it is much closer to a wolf than a dog on the canine spectrum, and that it was indeed rabid at the time of the attack. This was more or less expected. However, they discovered a surprise which Her Majesty's government believes it is essential for you to know. The biologists believe that a rabies shot will not work against the type of disease which the creature had been suffering from. Furthermore, they suspect that all members of this species are rabid, not just the one in the stadium. This species is therefore a clear and present danger to all of us. The scientists immediately set to work on an antivenom which will prevent future bite victims from getting sick. They then discovered something even worse. One of the chemicals inside the animal's blood is potentially lethal to human beings. Oxford claims that it has a 3-week incubation period, followed by a 1-week agonal period, and almost certain death. You heard me right, ladies and gentlemen. People who are bitten by this creature may have only 29 or 30 days to live. Needless to say, this horrified the doctors. So they brought in the wizards to see if they could do something about it before 1 June, the time at which the doctors would have expected the people bitten on 4 May to die. By coincidence, that is the day of the full moon. Minister of Magic Scrimgeour here ordered the wizards to work long hours, and they eventually came up with a possible antidote. They believe that although the agonal period cannot be avoided, death can be averted if a bite victim comes to the wizards for treatment as soon as he or she exhibits the first symptoms: headache and nausea. The Prime Minister leaned forward towards the camera. From what I have been told, 27 people were bitten by the creature in Wembley. We have identified a few of them, but not all. These people must present themselves to the Ministry of Magic prior to June 1st so they can begin their treatment. If you want any of these bite victims, or know such a person, please consider this information. We don't want people dying who can be saved just by visiting the Ministry of Magic. There is something else, however. The doctors have reason to believe that the disease may, I repeat may, become contagious after a bite victim has died. This condition will only take effect if the victim dies at the end of the agonal period. The body of the bite victim who died at the stadium is not a threat. This is another reason the people bitten in the stadium have to come to visit Scrimgeour. Not only will they die if they don't, They could endanger the lives of people around them. That's the story, ladies and gentlemen. Anyone who was bitten by one of these creatures or was in a room in which one of the victims died has to present him or herself to the Ministry of Magic prior to June 1st. The minister and his officials will brief the victims as to the nature of the disease and likely require a stay overnight on 1 June to ensure that the treatment is working. Minister Scrimgeour regrets to inform you that additional applications of the treatment may be necessary for the people who survive 1 June. The Prime Minister looked at Scrimgeour. I will now cede the floor to Minister Scrimgeour, who will explain how the bite victims are to contact the Ministry of Magic. Minister Scrimgeour. The camera panned left to focus on the wizard. Thank you, Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, do not panic. We believe that the treatment is safe and that it will prevent death. At present, though, the treatment is only temporary, so patients will likely need additional visits once every month or so to receive booster shots. Victims should call us at the telephone number shown at the bottom of the screen. I will give you a few moments to write it down. They should explain that they were bitten by the creature. One of our people will speak with you and explain how exactly the treatment is to proceed. Keep in mind, however, that you will be expected to present yourself at the location specified by the agent twice, once to receive the briefing and once on the night of the 31st to begin observation. Hopefully, we will find a permanent solution for those infected with the disease. Until then, this will have to suffice. With that, the camera panned back to the Prime Minister. That is all, ladies and gentlemen. We will now return to your regularly scheduled programming. However, the phone number will remain on the screen throughout the rest of the hour, so people who missed this message can write it down. Good night, people of Britain, and may God bless you all. With that, the screen reverted back to the football game. Peter didn't know what he was more irritated about, the fact that it was suddenly 1-1, or the fact that a big red Wembley dog attack victims call this number was plastered onto the bottom of the screen, followed by a phone number. How would he be able to watch the game with the players constantly running behind the words? Chapter 165, Damiel Exposed. Thursday, May 16, 1996, Rose Garden, the White House, Washington. Deke United States of America Horcruxes left. 3. Ring, Snake, Cup. Travis Radnor watched as the two witches who had saved Boston stepped up to stand beside the President of the United States. Radnor had already spent 15 minutes speaking about the bravery and dedication of the two young women, and had awarded each of them the Order of Merlin, First Class. He had been somewhat amused when the reporters covering the ceremony didn't realize how prestigious such an award was. He had been forced to explain the history of the Order of Merlin and indicate that the first-class award was similar in prestige to the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the award Clinton was about to bestow on the two women. Radnor and the president had been fielding questions about the Quabbin attack virtually non-stop for the past 24 hours. America for Humans was believed to be behind the attack, though at present no one had any proof. Stephen Pitmoss, the charismatic and bigoted preacher who was serving as the main driving force behind America for Humans, had tried to flee the Topeka area and had been caught in the small town of Culver, Kansas, along with Yolanda Dursley Burgess, the wife of America for Humans' founder Patrick Dursley Burgess. There were reports that Patrick had likely fled the Topeka area before the attack. No one knew where he was, and his car had last been seen parked at the Topeka airport so he could fly to Bangor, Maine. Pitmoss was going to be a problem. Although he had surrendered peacefully in Culver, people were taking bets as to whether he would survive long enough to face trial. People all over the country were burning him in effigy, and he had been forced to wear a bulletproof vest whenever authorities transferred him from prison to prison. Radnor could understand where the Americans were coming from, as the only sentence appropriate for the unprovoked murders of 7,400 people would be the death penalty. The Muggles would be for a surprise, however. Since the target had been a wizarding headquarters, and most of the victims had been wizards, the Baseball League protocol, some idiot in Fourth Mesa had come up with that name, and it had stuck, demanded that the trial be held under the jurisdiction of the wizarding authorities. This meant that Pitmoss would be subject to the Dementor's kiss if proven guilty. Living as a mindless shell without a soul would probably be worse than death from the Muggles' viewpoint. Radna watched as the president praised the two women. The Russian woman had been accompanied by her family and probably half of her sorority or dormitory. Guinevere de Mornay had brought along a Muggle boyfriend. The fact that a witch was dating a Muggle had triggered a whole new flurry of questions. What did it feel like to be dating a Muggle? Does she do magic tricks for you? Did she ensorcel you when she picked you up? How about love potions? How did the religious authorities feel about this? Radna had been intrigued by the differences in the way the two wizards reacted. Guinevere seemed to see Radna himself, and not the president, as the supreme authority. The Russian woman, however, seemed to respect Clinton more. He suspected that the Russian woman was either not originally from the United States, so she would not have known about the American Secretary of Magic, or had at least one Muggle parent. Oddly enough, the president seemed to pay attention to the Russian woman more than Guinevere. Several paparazzi figured that it was probably because the Russian woman didn't appear to have a boyfriend. The speech was boring, of course. Speeches usually were. So it was a bit of a relief when one of his aides walked up to him and whispered something in his ear. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption, but I believe we've found something in Greenwich that you're going to want to see." Radna frowned. "Can't it wait? I'm talking with the Muggle president here. I can't just get up and leave." "I believe so, sir. However, it's important that you come as quickly as possible when this is done. You see, I don't think America for Humans did it." Radna stared at the aide. "What? You've got to be kidding me." "I'm afraid not, sir. We've discovered some evidence that leads Sorceress Ariadne to believe that America for Humans was set up. Someone else was behind the attack and executed it in a way which was designed to frame America for Humans." Radna whistled quietly. "Who did it then, if not America for Humans?" "We believe it's Al-Qaeda, sir. That probably means Lord Voldemort through Damodharan Dilmy's successor." Radna jerked back in shock. "The British Dark Wizard, Tom Riddle." "Yes, sir." Radna paled but quickly composed himself for the cameras. "I want a full report when I get back." Dismissed. Half an hour later, the ceremony was over. Radna shook everyone's hands, and then apparated back to the Four Towns, or at least as close to the Four Towns as the security arrangements now permitted. The entire region around the Quabbin was now protected by a barrier that interrupted apparition. Visitors would have to be apparate outside the security zone, pass through a checkpoint, and then step through the apparition barrier into the Quabbin area proper. Once they were through the barrier, they could apparate to whatever destination in the Four Towns they wished. The administrative capital had been moved from the destroyed Dana to Enfield. Radna materialized just outside the Salem Witches' Academy, where Headmistress Ariadne appeared to have been waiting impatiently. The witch breathed a sigh of relief. "Merlin's beard, sir. That was a long meeting. What took so long?" Radna shrugged. The president made a long speech and probably spent half of it ogling the Russian woman. "You can't just skip out on the president, Persephone." Ariadne chuckled. "I see. At any rate, there's something you ought to see. Here, have some gillyweed." "Gillyweed?" "Yes, sir. We're going to be traveling into the remains of Greenwich. This means we're going to have to grow gills. Don't consume this until we've reached the border between Greenwich and Enfield. Once you eat it, you'll be able to breathe underwater for an hour, and you won't be able to breathe air. Do you understand, sir?" "Yes, I do." Ariadne nodded. "Good, follow me, sir." Ariadne updated him as they headed towards the barrier separating Enfield from the destroyed town. "We decided to investigate the Greenwich incident first." The mechanism behind the Greenwich attack seems much clearer, primarily because there were witnesses who saw the explosion and apparated out of Greenwich before the shield collapsed. We know where it happened, so we figured that would be a good place to search for evidence. Wouldn't some of the evidence have flowed out into Dana and Cambridge? Correct. However, there was enough stuff left over, primarily heavy stuff, near the point where the explosion took place. We interviewed some of the Muggle guards surrounding the reservoir, and they have reason to believe that an airplane may have been involved in the attack. The Muggles believed that they heard an engine, though they never saw the aircraft itself. Furthermore, several witnesses in Greenwich mentioned that something entered the water before it exploded. What do you mean, something? Couldn't they see what it was? No, however, judging from the splash pattern on the way in, the object had an unusual shape, a tapered front followed by a wider section. That was as far as it got before the explosion. We couldn't see the thing that made the splash itself, but the spray pattern gave it away. Radner suddenly got it, an airplane flying into the water. Ariadne nodded and stared at him. Not just that, an invisible airplane flying into the water. Radner stopped short. An invisible airplane. The Muggles have a way to make things invisible. Both he and Ariadne answered the question at the same time. No. Radner whistled as they approached the barrier. Then how could the airplane be invisible? Ariadne grimaced. You'll see for yourself, sir. Here, eat the gillyweed and follow me into the water. Radner did so, and his lungs locked up. He dove through the wall into the shattered Greenwich as flippers appeared on his feet. He looked around for Ariadne, who was pointing in a certain direction. Swimming through Greenwich was an unnerving experience. Bodies and debris were everywhere. He recognized most, if not all, of the people. Whoever did this was going to pay. They swam for about 10 minutes and eventually reached an area surrounded by mermaids. Ariadne spoke to them, and they stood aside to let the two officials pass. Inside the secured area were a few more bodies, but these bodies were remarkably different from the others. They were dressed like Muggles. There were 5 Muggles lying in various positions in the mud at the bottom of the reservoir. 4 of them were clearly American. The 5th appeared to be from India. Ariadne motioned him forward to the body of the Indian. Using magic as to not contaminate the crime scene, she rolled back the Indian's right arm. The Indian had a distinctive tattoo on his arm, the dark mark, the sign of Voldemort. Radner's jaw dropped. He took a glance at the other bodies and experienced his second shock. One of the dead was Patrick Dursley Burgess. He recognized the America for Humans leader from security bulletins. Fred Phelps, one of the preachers associated with America for Humans, was also there. He spun and turned to Ariadne. Voldemort and America for Humans working together, that makes no sense. Why would America for Humans ally with a wizard? Ariadne smirked. I bet they didn't realize he was a wizard. He probably passed off that tattoo as a college prank or something like that. Here's what I think happened. Sir America for Humans wanted to attack the witches. However, they didn't have any explosive weapons powerful enough to destroy the shield surrounding Greenwich. Voldemort, or Dilmy, found out about the group and realized that the Death Eaters could use America for Humans as a front. They provided America for Humans with a bomb, and then Fidelius the plane, so only the attackers could see it. The plane dropped the bomb on Dana, the most obvious target, as that's where your headquarters is, and then a struggle broke out in the cockpit. The plane spun out of control and crashed into the surface above Greenwich, triggering the second explosion. You mean to tell me Greenwich was just collateral damage? I'm afraid so, sir. On the other hand, they had no way to tell that destroying the shield for one town wouldn't drown all 4. It's obvious that they thought they could knock out all 4 towns with one bomb, so they didn't realize that additional people would be killed if the plane crashed into the surface. At any rate, back to the plan. Whoever set this up was a genius. The attackers don't realize magic is involved because they can see the plane. If the attack fails, nothing happens. If the attack succeeds and America retaliates, Al-Qaeda doesn't claim responsibility and America for humans get punished. If the attack succeeds and America surrenders, Al-Qaeda steals America for humans' thunder. Voldemort had nothing to lose and everything to gain, particularly if he plans a magical attack on the United States at some point. Radner shuddered. I don't even want to think about that. Why do you think it's Al-Qaeda? Because the man is Indian. Dilmy had managed to recruit a lot of people from the Indian subcontinent before he was killed. Most of them were involved with Al-Qaeda, or at the very least came through Dilmy, and Dilmy ran Al-Qaeda. Radner suddenly realized something, and Dilmy mentioned a possible attack in the US not long ago. Exactly. I think we're going to need to tell the president that America for Humans had help here, and that he's going to have to start widening the investigation. One more thing, sir. I believe we have the Indian's name. Mahatma Damil, known Death Eater. Really? How did you know? Ariadne motioned Radner over and pointed at the ground. Radner was astonished to see a wand lying right next to Patrick Dursley Burgess's body. The Indian brought his wand along, and of course Dialynis registers all wands. This is Damil's wand. He did it. Radner needed to tell the president immediately. Chapter 166, Planned Coup. Thursday, May 16, 1996. Ministry of Magic. South Korea Horcruxes left. 3. Ring, Snake, Cup. Choi Yoon-lee watched as the Minister of Magic leaned over the table and glanced around the room. 5 more days, ladies and gentlemen. All of our agents are in position and have the dates circled on the calendar. If everything goes as planned, ancestors willing, we will have liberated our brothers north of the DMZ. The South Koreans had realized very quickly that it was only a matter of time until Kim Jong-il managed to dredge up a force of wizards which would tighten the dear leader's grip on the north. Choi Yoon had assured everyone that her former homeland was falling apart as is, and new leadership was necessary. She had originally been reluctant to go so far as to try to attempt a coup, but the South's ministers had changed her mind in a hurry. Particularly now that the South had organized magical forces, and the North did not. The biggest debate had been what to do with Kim Jong-il himself. Several people wanted him assassinated and replaced with either a wizard from the South or an imperiust Kim Jong-un. The problem with this, of course, was that an assassination would make a martyr out of him and almost certainly trigger a counter-coup by the people whose lives depended on their proximity to the dear leader. Kim Jong-un would almost certainly vow revenge. The assassination attempt could also fail, giving an injured and angry man an obvious excuse for renewing hostilities with the South. A renewed war with the South could easily escalate and trigger World War Roman III, complete with nuclear weapons. This meant that the dear leader had to survive, but be in a position to reform his agenda. There were 2 ways to accomplish this. One option involved killing him and shaving his head completely to provide years' worth of fuel for a polyjuice potion. The catches here were the possibility that someone managed to find the body, or that the fake Kim Jong-il would be stuck somewhere for an hour and revert back to his true form. The second option involved imperiusing him. The danger with that, of course, is that strong-willed people could often overcome the imperious curse. The dear leader was far from stupid, and he was extremely strong-willed. The South couldn't count on the imperious curse working. Both of the solutions, which involved a surviving Kim Jong-il or someone posing as Kim Jong-il, had another issue as well. Most people would probably get very suspicious if the dear leader suddenly started changing his tune. There would likely be an investigation, one which could uncover the plot. The rebels would be executed, Kim Jong-il would revert back to his old state, and the South would be in big trouble. Regardless of what happened to the dear leader, the South Korean military had to be kept out of it. Even Muggles would suspect that something strange was going on if unfamiliar tanks suddenly started parading down the streets of Pyongyang. The North would immediately suspect a coup and fighting would break out. That would restart the war and likely kill thousands of civilians in Pyongyang. There was also the issue that the deployment of large numbers of people couldn't be done silently and secretly. The group had eventually decided on killing Kim Jong-il in a way which made it look like a heart attack. This tactic had already been shown to work, as it had been the means Dilmi and his cadre had employed to take over Al-Qaeda. The killing curse could work for that, and that would rule out any obvious foul play from the perspective of the Muggles. Kim Jong-un would then be imperieused. If the new ruler did not have the willpower to overcome the South's control, all would be well and good. If he did, he would be killed off and polyjuiced. Kim Jong-un was not nearly as well known as his brother, so it wouldn't be as much of a surprise for him to suddenly start discussion reconciliation with the South and improved standards of living for the peasantry. The South's Muggle government, of course, would disavow any knowledge of wizard involvement in the coup. Wizards using their power to overthrow Muggle heads of state, even corrupt ones, would almost certainly set a very dangerous precedent that the South Korean government refused to accept the responsibility for. The current plan had no fewer than 60 wizards, including a good quarter of the staff of the South Korean Ministry of Magic, involved in the mission. It was extremely unlikely that they would all be needed, as the South had not heard any rumors that the North had managed to recruit some wizards to its cause. However, there always was a chance that Kim Jong-il had managed to do so and was deliberately leaking false information. If so, a fierce magical battle could ensue. Choi Yoon fervently hoped that 60 wizards would be enough to do the job. She suspected that the North would likely have the advantage in such a fight. First, they were far more familiar with the terrain in and around the presidential palace, where Kim Jong-il would almost certainly be. Second, the wizards from the North would not have any qualms killing any Muggles or civilians who were caught in the crossfire. The South had already agreed not to attack civilians. Although maintaining the neutrality of the civilians was unquestionably the right thing to do, it would likely handicap the South's wizards during the takeover attempt. Choi Yoon shuddered to consider what she would do if she were forced to try to attack a fortified room surrounded by human shields. Finally, the North would likely have platoons of Muggle soldiers in the presidential palace who could be called upon to support the North's wizards and the dear leader. The South would have fewer Muggles, if any, on the front lines of the coup attempt. Finally, people had to watch the DMZ. Any rumors of a coup in either Seoul or Pyongyang would almost certainly put the soldiers guarding the DMZ on high alert. Once that happened, one false alarm or bungled signal could result in shots being fired. And once shots were fired, things could escalate in a hurry. Choi Yoon had argued for the wizards to block off the center of the DMZ with a wall of force so that no soldiers could cross from either side. The Minister of Magic shot that down quickly, however, as all a soldier had to do would be to fire his weapon and watch his bullet hit something in midair. An invisible object he didn't know about is blocking the DMZ. Obviously, it was the other guy's wizards, which in turn implied that it would probably let their soldiers and bullets through. It means that your side is in big trouble. You're going to call for tanks, reinforcements, and so forth, and almost certainly get a formal request for support from your own Ministry of Magic. Once the two Ministry of Magics were fighting each other, things would get ugly. There had been many debates over the past few months as to whether a magical attack would be more terrifying than a nuclear attack. Nuclear bombs were tremendously destructive, but the Muggle world knew about them and what they could do. Magical attacks, on the other hand, were virtually unknown. The Muggles had no idea what the wizards could and could not do. For all they knew, the wizards could tow the entire Korean peninsula into the sea and sink it. Choi Yoon knew that none of the wizards on this planet could even begin to do that to even something a kilometer across. The Muggles, however, didn't, and their view of magic had been warped by the blatant lies and misconceptions spread by fantasy literature. Choi Yoon and the Ministry had spent a long time working on this plan. However, even the best battle plan never survived contact with the enemy. She could only ask her ancestors to provide her with guidance during the upcoming campaign. 5 more days, and she would know for sure. Chapter 167, Asylum for Afia. Friday, May 17, 1996, 4 days to North Korean coup attempt Russian House Massachusetts Institute of Technology Cambridge. Massachusetts United States of America Horcruxes left. 3. Ring, snake, cup. The Russian house witch had had a very busy week. She had spent Saturday and Sunday studying for finals and thinking ahead to graduation. She figured she'd at least try to stay on as the graduate residence tutor for Russian House at some point. Tests made her nervous, just like everyone else. The Ministry of Magic had gone bonkers over her prophecy. She trusted Dina and Lee to keep the secret, so the Muggles wouldn't find out about it. Yet scarcely an hour would go by before someone in the ministry brought up the rising sun prophecy, the dawn ash prophecy, the Romanov prophecy, or one of its other synonyms in a conversations. Although the prophecy was vague, as usual the general consensus was that the wizarding branch of the Romanovs was in danger now that the statute of secrecy had been breached. The fact that Rasputin had managed to come back via Horcrux hadn't helped the Romanovs' cause either. Why a witch in the United States, as compared to someone in the Romanov family itself, had been chosen to be the instrument of prophecy was unclear, though. Usually the seer had something to do with the prophecy, or at the very least it involved something important to him or her. Perhaps the powers that be thought that she would be an appropriate medium because of her Russian heritage. Monday had gone about just as well as expected, with more stuff related to finals. As usual, a difficult day, but not unexpected at this time of year. However, the problems on Monday had paled to what had happened the next morning. She hated to think what would have happened had Rebecca Nurse not alerted her to the attack. She probably would have only found out about it once water had started flooding the corridor connecting the MacGregor low-rise and new house. Several minutes could have gone by in that time, during which J entry could have flooded out completely and the Massachusetts Avenue Bridge collapsed. That delay could have cost 1,000 more Muggles their lives and could have given the floodwaters enough time to topple the high-rise. Granted, that was nothing compared to what had happened in the 2 flooded towns. But lives were saved nonetheless, and in all fairness from the Muggles' perspectives, the deaths of the Canterburyans would likely impact their world more than the deaths of wizards they hadn't heard of until February. As it was, J entry was under 2 feet of water. E entry and what was left of F entry were in absolute shambles. Most of the students' possessions in the storerooms in the basement of the high-rise had also been ruined. By the time she had finished plugging the I entry corridor, the water had started flowing through the tunnel to New House. She had just enough strength left to conjure up a force field to seal off the corridor before she had collapsed. All finals were put on hold as the school began to clean up. She had planned to help with the operation and had to somehow extract herself from hundreds of reporters who were trying to interview her. One look at what was left of the cabin confirmed her suspicion that it would take at least a month to clean everything up. Boston would need a new water supply in a hurry, but she had no idea how to purify water. The Secret Service had knocked on her door Thursday morning to fly her and Guinevere over to Washington to receive their awards. She said that she and Guinevere would be able to apparate over there, but the agents insisted, claiming that the Muggles wanted to welcome the 2 of them at the airport as they landed. Besides, apparation into the White House was prohibited. Guinevere's boyfriend, the Muggle from Ak, had come with her. She wasn't seeing anyone, though she suspected that would change in a hurry given the way the reporters were handling the case, and had convinced them to bring several of her friends and family along. They'd pinned a few medals on her jacket and said things which sounded a hell of a lot more heroic than the stuff that she actually did. What did she deserve all this for? Anyone with the magical ability would have helped in those circumstances. She hadn't been special. She was busy wondering what to do next with her life when she heard a knock on the door. She gritted her teeth. Not more paparazzi. Bracing herself, she opened the door and saw two people who looked vaguely familiar. One was a tall Marine woman with the name D. Janich on her uniform, probably some former Mitt Rock girl, the witch thought, who had been called in to keep the student body from going to peace in the aftermath of the attack. The other one was an Indian woman who seemed determined to see her, yet oddly frightened and embarrassed. The Indian stammered a little. "I'm sorry for bothering you, but I was wondering if I could talk to you. My name is Afia Siddiqui, and there's something I need to tell you. It's urgent." The witch shrugged. "I don't have much time, Afia. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done here." Siddiqui lowered her voice. "I used to be a member of Al-Qaeda and defected. They're responsible for the attack on the Quabbin, and they assigned me a task in preparation for this attack, which I thankfully did not carry out. If there's anything I can do to help, tell me." The witch gasped as the Marine nearly fell over in shock. Both recovered quickly and shouted, "What?" The Marine promptly started arguing with Siddiqui. Supposedly, they had both lived in McCormick and knew each other, but the Marine hadn't known about the woman's secret career. Eventually, the witch had to raise her voice to cut over the din. "You can argue about this later, ladies. She's a defector, so I think behooves both of us to at least hear what she was about to say." Siddiqui took a deep breath. "Very well. You're not going to like this, though." The witch grated her teeth. "Judging from what happened this past week, we've to deal with a lot of things we haven't liked. Spit it out." Siddiqui backed off a little. "Well, Dammit Heron Dilmy called me in shortly before the attack." The Marine cut in, the former head of Al-Qaeda. "Yes, deed. He was a wizard. He told me that he wanted me to do something, and I had to do it before the 14th. It was obvious that something big was going to be happening then, but I didn't have all the details as I wasn't highly placed enough to know most of them." The witch tried to maintain control of her emotions. "I see. What did he want you to do?" Siddiqui hesitated. The woman suddenly had a pleading expression on her face. "Well, he ordered me to kill you and I decided against it." The witch glared at her as she and the Marine immediately got into another argument. Finally, when she could get a word in edgewise, "You're kidding." "Allah preserve me, I wish I were. Unfortunately, I'm telling the truth. They gave me a funny knife which opens all doors so I could break into Russian house. Here, you can take a look at it." Siddiqui reached into her pocket, drawing a stern look from the Marine, and drew out a knife. She handed it hilt first to the witch. The witch inspected it closely. Bringing out her wand, she tapped the knife with the tip. It began to glow brightly. She whistled. "It's a magical item, all right. I don't know how you could have gotten one of these. Muggles aren't supposed to have them. Dilmy gave it to me. I wasn't particularly keen on killing anyone, but orders were orders. At any rate, I asked for a painless poison to make your death as humane as possible and broke into Russian house to anoint it on your toiletries. If everything went as planned, you would have passed on peacefully in your sleep. You would not have suffered. However, before I could do the deed, a couple of girls took you aside into the living room. Then you said something about the house of Romanov falling in 6 years." The witch shrieked and pointed her wand between Siddiqui's eyes, which widened even further. Meanwhile, the Marine stared at her and yelled, "What do you mean, House of Romanov? The Romanovs were killed in 1917. Well, Anastasia." That was as far she got before the witch roared at Siddiqui. "How did you find out about that?" Siddiqui wailed, "I was in your room. I was trying to figure out where you kept your toiletries. I overheard everything. At any rate, you started discussing this prophecy, or whatever it was with these other two girls, and it was obvious that you didn't mean any harm. That, your obvious power as a witch, and my distaste for murder killing someone convinced me to defect. I am yours to command, and if you're willing to accept me, I want asylum in the Ministry of Magic." I am now convinced that Allah let me join the terrorist organization so that he could use me to undermine and eventually betray it to government forces. He probably saved thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of people in the Boston area by inspiring me to save your life. I feel awed, frightened, and honored to have been an instrument of his will. The witch's mind raced. She looked at the Marine, who looked like she didn't know what she was supposed to do either. Clearly, the two women had known each other from McCormick and had likely been friends. Now, on the other hand, finally, the solution came to her. Afia, would you be willing to take an unbreakable oath and swear that you will never return to Al-Qaeda or mention the prophecy to anyone without explicit permission? Siddiqui looked at her, puzzled. Unbreakable oath, what's that? It's an oath which will kill you if you violate it. Behind Siddiqui, Janich grunted in surprise. The witch hated to think what would happen if the government started subjecting everyone to unbreakable oaths. Well, they'd need wands for that, and she doubted that the wizards would consent to administering unbreakable oaths on a whim. Marines may have guns, but wands could beat guns if the wizard was prepared. Meanwhile, the witch paled, but nodded, asking the Marine to serve as a witness and to not divulge the prophecy to Muggles. She was a soldier, so she knew how to keep secrets. She administered the unbreakable oath and ordered Siddiqui to vow never to serve terrorist organizations or discuss the prophecy again. Siddiqui obeyed immediately and in Allah's name. The former terrorist then went even further and, out of her own volition, pledged her allegiance to the United States and the American Department of Magic. The witch and the Marine traded glances and nodded. It was obvious that this woman was sincere. She wanted to make amends and was willing to risk her life to do so. The witch removed the wand and looked at Siddiqui thoughtfully for a minute. Meanwhile, Janich took her hand off her gun. Thank you for your support, Afia. Would you be willing to speak with some of our authorities in the two surviving towns? I suspect that several people will want to speak with you. Siddiqui nodded immediately. The witch then grasped her hand and apparated to Enfield, leaving an astonished former student alone in the room. Wondering how she was going to explain all this to her commanding officer, she left Russian House and began heading back to her position in front of McCormick. Chapter 168. Bad Time for a Cruise. Friday, May 17, 1996. 4 days to North Korean Ku Attemptnu Munum / S Nordum Fort Lauderdale, Florida, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 3. Ring, Snake, Cup. Harrison Cooper had heard of large ships before. This one, however, was at the very least the size of a city block. He and Courtney Hand wrangled for months over what they should do for their honeymoon. They wanted to splurge, but they didn't want to break the bank. They figured they'd keep it to £5,000 maximum. For a 3 or 4 week vacation, that could be doable. Around the world in a month. Too much time waiting at airports. A vacation in Australia. You'd need a month to get over the jet lag. A trip to Tahiti. It would work, but they'd probably get bored after a while. Finally, they'd stumbled across a solution in the Holland America catalog. The cruise ship Nordum was going to be embarking on a month-long trip through the Caribbean, leaving on 17 May and returning on 13 June. It would visit most of the islands in the chain, which would give the guests the opportunity to see many different cultures. And best of all, the two of them wouldn't have to drive anywhere. The boat would take them to each destination. Harrison couldn't keep track of all the destinations. All he knew was that the first stop was Key West. 1 June, the night of the full moon, would be spent between the Dutch Antilles islands of Aruba and Curacao. The only reason he remembered that is that he had made a deal with the cruise line to do something special for the two of them that night under the light of the full moon. He had already hinted to Courtney that something really exciting would happen that night. That had piqued her interest, but at least to this point he hadn't spilled the beans. They had flown out from England the day before. Harrison could not have known that while they were in the air, the Prime Minister had issued a statement warning everyone who had been bitten in Wembley Stadium dog attack to report to the Ministry of Magic on 1 June. Harrison had been one of those victims. He had been in the stands near the mysterious man with the mustache when the dog had appeared back on the 4th. He had been bitten, of all places, on the buttocks, trying to keep the animal away from some of the other fans. Thankfully, the bite appeared to have been minor, and the bleeding had stopped after a few minutes. A rabies shot administered during the match had apparently taken care of everything. It still ached to sit from time to time, but the pain was going away in a hurry. Courtney, of course, had gone ballistic as soon as she had seen the injury. She demanded that he go to the hospital, but he said that he felt fine and that everything had been taken care of at the stadium. His wife hadn't gone to the match with him because she had been out at a friend's baby shower. Harrison suspected that she was trying to think of what she could do for her own shower, as she was 3 months along already. He didn't know what that dog had done, but he felt great. He developed a craving for red meat, and his metabolism had increased. His senses seemed much sharper. His wife had noticed this as well, and had jokingly started calling him Spider-Man, with the out-of-control Great Dane, or whatever it was replacing the radioactive spider. He hadn't told anyone else about the injury. His parents would have probably insisted that he cancel the trip and hospitalize himself. They tended to be paranoid about everything. Either that, or they would start asking him embarrassing questions as to how a dog managed to bite him on the rear end. He and his wife had to fill out a whole series of documents before the Holland America representatives handed them their stateroom keys. There had been a brief argument about whether they should upgrade to a stateroom with a balcony. He had told her that the ship almost certainly had a promenade deck which allowed passengers to spend time outside, so the upgrade was probably not worth it. However, she had countered that this was a honeymoon and a private balcony would give them the opportunity to do things which would not be appropriate in a public domain. So he had given in. They crossed the gangplank into the boat for the first time and were absolutely blown away by the opulence. Courtney mentioned that she actually felt embarrassed by all this. There were statues in little niches in the hallways, gold leaf on the elevator doors, and other touches which seemed to make the boat more suitable for the Vanderbilts than for ordinary Brits like them. Harrison shuddered to think about what the more opulent cruise lines were like. Holland America was supposedly low-end. They took a quick tour of the boat. There was a room which served as a combination reading room, library, and board game area. Another section had an honest-to-good casino and duty-free shop, currently closed in it. They'd have to change their pound notes to dollars to use the machines, however. Perhaps they get a chance to do that at Half Moon Key in the Bahamas. The ship just went on and on. There were jazz clubs, nightclubs, 2 swimming pools, a fitness center, a sauna and private massage pool for an extra fee, an art gallery, and a formal dining room which occupied the entire stern of the ship. There was an auditorium for lectures and performances as well. There was a game room, a cocktail lounge, and a sports section on the top deck which included a basketball court. Finally, the topmost deck, Lido Deck, had a small cafeteria which served as an informal dining room. The two of them couldn't imagine themselves as possibly being able to do everything and go on all the excursions. Then again, the cruise was going to be almost a month in duration, and there would be a lot of time traveling from island to island. Most of the stops allowed the passengers maybe 6-8 hours to visit the island, with the exception of Curacao, which allowed the full day. They headed up to the cocktail lounge for a special welcome event dedicated to honeymooners. Most of the people on the cruise ship were youthfully challenged, according to Courtney. He suspected that the two of them were probably a good 40 years younger than the median age on the boat. They found a chance to hobnob with people their age refreshing. Inevitably, the honeymooners began to glom together into a little group. By the time the cocktail night was over, with Courtney dutifully refusing to drink, he and his wife had traded business cards and stateroom locations with no fewer than 10 couples. They were from all over the world. 4 from the United States, 1 from Vietnam, 1 from France, 1 from Russia, 1 from South Africa. I want to skip winter. 1 from China, and 1 from Chile of all places. A couple of them had small kids with them which, they assured everyone, had been born after the couple had been married. Judging from the ages of the children, however, Harrison doubted it. It took them a good 15 minutes to find their room. It was relatively small, but did in fact have a balcony, just as the brochure promised. There was a TV and a sitting area along with a wet bar. On the bar was a document listing the possible shore excursions. The shore excursions ranged from trips to the western part of Curacao to kayaking in St. Thomas. They spent a good 20 minutes looking over the options. Harrison wanted to do all of them. It was a pity that each of them cost money, some in excess of $100 per person. On a 1-month cruise, that would add up. They'd have to be careful. Courtney inevitably brought him back to reality. People only got married once, at least in theory. This was a honeymoon, a once-in-a-lifetime experience. They had used their financial restraint when it came to booking the cruise and doing it during off-peak times. They could afford to splurge on the shore excursions. Harrison thought about it some more and eventually agreed. They then promptly started arguing over what to do on Key West.